cannot see you, but I think you can see me. Thank you, Arno, for those wonderful words. It was a delight to meet you, and also Suzanne, and I thank you for inviting me here to this project. It's a very interesting project that they have undertaken, and of course with all of you. I would like to thank everybody who organized the event, and Marcus and also Elizabeth for responding to my emails. Thanks to them as well. All right, so I chose this topic because in ancient schools of philosophy, the bodily regimes were part of their way of doing philosophy. So after the Greeks and of course the Romans, there's a decline in bodily regimes, and then there's of course a revival in later times. Now, just before I start with my presentation, I would like to talk about what I mean by bodily regimes. Well, obviously it's an expression, the things that we do with the body. So what are some of the domains or fields? Those are sports, athletics, and theater, arts, and what else? Eroticism, sexuality, and dance, of course. So all the things that have to do with the body directly. And ancient Greeks had all of these already in place by the time, or around the time the Greek schools of philosophy started in 6th century BC. So the bottom line is that Greek philosophers were already part of a culture that was rich in these bodily regimes, and many of these schools, including the Socratic school that today has come under criticism, especially since Nietzsche, they were also engaged in the Socratic school eroticism. That those who read philosophy would know that the whole thing about the homoerotica, both with Plato and Socrates, and most likely Plato, whom we don't today like that much because of his idealism, was more active in the bodily area than the moderns, or than I don't want to say than us, but they were very much active. Plato especially was for practicing homoerotic love. So having said that, I chose the Cynics because out of those schools, Cynics, out of the post-Socratic schools, the Cynics engaged in performative acts as they were doing philosophy. Most likely they were the only ones who engaged in such performative acts out of all the post-Socratic schools in a direct way. I mean, in the limited sense, it's all about performance. Socrates too, when he did philosophy in the Agora, he was putting up a show in a way, but relying on words more than maybe his acts, whereas the Cynics used gestures. So, in order to sort of present these ideas about performative philosophy, I chose 5 topics. You can see them right there on the wall. Ecstasis, aggression, transgression, eroticism, and metaphor. There could be others that they use, but I focused on these, so I will talk about them. Unfortunately, we know very little about the Cynics. None of their writings survived. So we know about them through Diogenes Laertius, who lived in 2nd or 3rd century AD. So he reports on all these previous philosophers, and we know a lot about Cynics through him, his writings, and what the Cynics did, and what kinds of performances they put up, especially with Diogenes, who is not the founder of Cynicism, but is the most known Cynic from 4th century BC. So let's start with ecstasis. That's the Dionysian in Nietzsche's terminology. Nietzsche is the first philosopher to bring out this whole thing about the Dionysian in 19th century philosophy. And now in Greek theater, according to Nietzsche, there was a core of the Dionysian, which was a chorus. They sustained that ecstatic sensibility. Ecstasis means literally coming out of yourself, like what actors do, and being connected to others. So being actually one with the whole being, if you will. And it's interesting that we often, Nietzsche readers, forget this, that Nietzsche is primarily a Dionysian thinker, and he presented in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, as one of the most important things in human culture and the arts. It is about being connected, pretty much, and that has to do with coming out of oneself, ecstasis. Nietzsche also, I will go to the cynics, but Nietzsche also understood this, the core of ecstasy in Greek drama by way of Seder chorus. Seder, I think in German, satir, is that the satir? Yeah. And well, we don't have any satyr plays or Seder plays left except one from Euripides, Cyclops. It's not the best example, but the Seder play, those who know Greek drama, that was the fourth drama after the trilogy, and it was supposed to be somewhat comical after this trilogy, the dramatic trilogy, which had to do with the suffering and the fall of the hero. Who are the satyrs? They were, I have some, you may have seen some of these pictures from Greek paintings. They were the male members of the cult of Dionysus, as opposed to the Maenads, the female members of the cult of Dionysus. And they were very much, they were half animal, half human. So that actually for Nietzsche showed the connection between the human and the animal world. So by seeing satyrs on stage, one was connected to the animal world, which is a little bit the body. Obviously we are animals, we are animal beings, which we have forgotten. We have a body, we live in a body, and many of the performances and lectures in this gathering, we have already seen that especially yesterday, the two presenters who talk about the primordial aspects of the body. So now with the cynics, now how did they achieve this? Now, before the cynics again, Greek theater is older than the rise of cynicism. Greek theater emerged in 6th century BC. So by the time we come to 5th century BC, it's the height of Greek theater. So cynics were aware of all of these. So were the other schools of philosophy. Now, how did the cynics exercise their form of ecstasy? Well, they were connected to the animal world. They honored animals. They were very much skeptical of human conventions, and they identified themselves with animals, especially dogs. And that's actually the word kune, a dog. So that dogists, and you would always see cynic philosophers with some dogs. So they are dog philosophers. Today that would be a blasphemy, right, to call a philosopher an animal. But they had no problems with associating themselves with animals. I have a passage that explains what I mean by ecstasy in my book. Ecstasy is coming out of oneself, or the loss of oneself. Now the ultimate loss is one's own death, so our mortality. But in the course of our life, we can experience ecstatic moments as we come out of our ordinary way of living, like performance and theater. So these are forms of ecstasis. And cynics did that with their shameful acts. I have one example from Diogenes Laertius. This is an example for how the cynics created some kind of ecstasy. Once at a banquet, some of the guests threw him bones as if he had been a dog. So he, as he went away, put up his leg against them as if he had been a dog in reality, meaning he pissed on the other side. So, you know, today we don't practice these cynical acts, but pissing on people was part of a cynical act, and it was supposed to mean something. So it's not just words, but also a gesture. And that was a shameful act, even for Greeks, although they went to whatever, they did their bodily functions in the public space, like the bathrooms and things like that, but I believe pissing on someone would still be shameful within the Greek context. So but they did exercise that. So moving along, I should come back to my list. The second thing, aggression and violence. That's actually a theme that I work on in philosophy of sports. It's aggression, of course, within its own context, like agonistics. Ancient Greeks started the cultural competition in 8th century BC. This is the whole Olympic tradition, and many of the games were aggressive. And for them, that was an outlet to externalize their destructive animal energies, which for Nietzsche is extremely important. Later on also Freud is going to pick up on this, but it's already in Nietzsche, what we do with our aggressive instincts, destructive instincts, how we channel them out. And that's actually the sign of the culture, what we do with these destructive things. So he sees the genius of transfiguration in the agonistic Greeks, how they channeled their energies. Violence is discussed also by Artaud within the context of theater. And of course, again, Artaud also means refined or violence within its own context. So neither Nietzsche nor Artaud meant violence to be in any sort of social sense that is outside its context, or hors de concours, as the French would call it. Violence is necessary, this I'm quoting from my book, violence is necessary to attack the spectator and shake all the organs. That's very much Artaudian. To say that violence in spectacle would lead to the exacerbation of social problems, as argued by moralists today, and in the past, would be as ridiculous as to claim that nudity in spectacle would cause orgasmic responses from the spectators. Just as we accept nudity in spectacle, we can accept violence in spectacle, and that has to do with catharsis, to use Aristotle's phrase, catharsis of certain emotions. But Nietzsche went beyond the limited notion of catharsis in Aristotle. It's, I think, I don't know what Aristotle would say about externalization of violence. He was talking about theater specifically, but I think Nietzsche wouldn't have any problems with violence in sports, for instance, which the Greeks had, like especially Pancratian. Now, I am going to cynics. Cynics, we really don't know much about their use of violence, but I found one example from Diogenes Laertius, and it's a quotation. And when a man who was very superstitious said to him, "With one blow I will break your head," and he replied, that should be Diogenes, that should be the cynic Diogenes, and he replied, "With one sneeze will make you tremble." So that's the only actually example that I found that showed that they used direct aggressive acts towards their disciples or interlocutors. But I'm sure some other acts that they did were maybe less physically violent, but still could be violent in a non-physical sense, like pissing on someone could be actually a violent act. So moving along to my third point about cynics' transgression. Now that's another important topic, both with the Greeks and Nietzsche and the cynics. Transgression is extremely important in Nietzsche's philosophy, and in fact it appears in The Birth of Tragedy, where he discusses the myth of Prometheus. That also came up in one of the performances yesterday. I heard, I can't remember now, there's so many things happening for the Prometheus. Anyone remembers? There was a discussion of Prometheus in that other room. I forgot his name. The performer that was talking all the time. Yeah, yes, thank you. Yeah, he talked about the myth of Prometheus, not in the same way as Nietzsche does. For Nietzsche, Prometheus symbolizes active sin. He uses the term sin, active, he uses the term sin because it happens within a religious context, but in a larger sense, it is actually transgression, going beyond the limits, the established limits. Prometheus, as you would know, transgressed the law of Zeus to bring fire to humanity. It was a transgressive act to raise our standards for higher standards. But for Nietzsche later, that would be übermenschlich, the overhumanly states. So he contrasts that to the passive sin of Adam and Eve story. So we suffer from passive sin, meaning our cultures, monotheistic traditions, do not allow any kind of transgression. or we suffer from passive transgressions, whereas there can be active transgressions where we sort of go beyond the limits, beyond the established norms to create something higher, but yet still do not commit any injustice under the rules of Moira. Moira, these fates, the goddesses, they sit, for Nietzsche too, they sit on top. So Prometheus is committing his transgression within still the bounds of this overarching sense of justice, whatever that may be, but that are represented by the Moira. So transgression, one important philosopher on this is Bataille. I will not talk about Bataille here. I have to go back to the Cynics, Bataille, and also in the 20th century Jean Genet. So if you like to read more about transgression, they're very much, both of them are Nietzschean, to see what role transgression plays in culture in terms of enhancing us and taking us towards higher states. Now the cynicism, what were some of the things that they did that they would be considered transgressive, other than pissing on people, masturbating in public? I think that was a no-no for Greek standards. Greeks were free with their sexual functions, but those freedoms happened within their cult domains. So they would not engage in sexual acts in any place. If they had orgies or it is symposium, drinking parties, they were always within their own domain, not in the public domain. So these things, masturbating in public, would still be transgressive even in their time. So Diogenes is said to have masturbated whatever in the agora, wherever he was living, and that was a transgressive act. I don't know what, if he had any intention or